What destroys families isn't betrayal, it's the shadow finally demanding its due. A woman who's been the perfect wife, mother, caretaker for 20 years suddenly starts acting like someone you don't recognize. She's seeking attention, making reckless choices, burning down everything stable. Everyone calls it a midlife crisis. But what if I told you it's actually a psychological eruption that's been building for decades? In the next 50 minutes, you'll understand the real mechanism behind what Jung called the shadow's revenge and get a practical protocol to navigate this crisis before it destroys everything you've built. If you've watched someone you love transform seemingly overnight, or felt this chaos stirring within yourself, you're witnessing something far deeper than selfishness or vanity. You're seeing the psyche's desperate attempt to reclaim what's been buried alive. So what's actually happening in the mind of a woman over 40 who seems to be losing herself? Let's be clear about who we're talking about. This isn't every woman over 40. This is the woman who gave herself away piece by piece, who built her identity around being needed, being good, being the emotional caretaker of everyone else's life. She's 42, maybe 45. Her children are becoming independent. Her husband sees her as reliable, stable, the foundation he can count on. But something's shifted. She finds herself scrolling through old photos, reconnecting with people from her past, maybe flirting with attention she hasn't felt in years. From the outside, it looks like she's destroying everything good in her life. From the inside, it feels like she's finally coming alive. What everyone around her sees as betrayal or destructive behavior, she experiences as the first breath of air after years of suffocation. But neither perspective tells the whole story. Sarah was one of these women. At 44, she had what everyone called the perfect life. 3 kids, successful, husband, beautiful home. But she felt like she was suffocating behind a mask that no longer fit. When she started an emotional affair with a coworker, everyone saw it as betrayal. What they didn't see was a woman desperately trying to reconnect with parts of herself she'd lost 20 years ago. The affair wasn't really about the other man. It was about a woman trying to find herself through someone else's eyes because she'd forgotten how to see herself clearly. This is what Jung meant when he said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The midlife crisis in women isn't about vanity or selfishness. It's about the psyche's desperate attempt to heal a split that's been growing for decades. Understanding this split is the first step toward healing it. The first trigger happens when biology meets psychology in a perfect storm. Around 35 to 45 women face what I call the biological collision. Fertility is declining, estrogen is shifting, and the mirror reflects changes that can't be hidden anymore. But here's what most people miss. This isn't just about vanity or the fear of aging. It's about something much deeper. In our culture, a woman's value has been tied to her youth, her fertility, her ability to be desired. When those markers start fading, it triggers what Jung called an archetypal crisis, the forced transition from the maiden through the mother toward the crone. The problem is that modern society rejects the crone archetype completely. We have no reverence for the wise older woman. Instead, we have anti-aging creams and the desperate pursuit of remaining forever young. When a woman can no longer avoid this transition, her psyche rebels. Think about it this way: our ancestors had ceremonies and rituals to mark these transitions. They understood that becoming an elder was about gaining power, not losing it. But we've stripped away these meanings, leaving women to face one of life's most profound transitions without any cultural support or guidance. The result is a psychological crisis that manifests as seemingly destructive behavior. The biological collision isn't just about hormones, though they play a role. It's about the collision between who a woman has been and who her deepening psyche is demanding she become. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. The biological collision is your psyche's way of saying time's up on being who everyone else needed you to be. Here's what you can do right now. If you're experiencing this collision, spend 5 minutes writing down what you gained from each decade of your life, not what you lost. The goal is to see the accumulation of depth, not the subtraction of youth. This simple practice begins to shift your relationship with aging from loss to transformation. The persona is Jung's term for the social mask. We wear the version of ourselves we present to meet others' expectations. For many women, this persona was built around being the caregiver, the nurturer, the one who puts everyone else first. They became experts at reading rooms, managing emotions, keeping everyone happy and comfortable. But personas aren't meant to last forever. They're supposed to serve us through certain life phases, then evolve. When they become rigid, they become prisons. Lisa spent 15 years being the perfect corporate wife, hosting dinner parties, supporting her husband's career, managing the household like a CEO. She was praised for being so together, so selfless. Everyone admired how she made it all look effortless. But inside, she felt like she was disappearing. The woman who once had dreams of becoming an artist had been buried under years of shouldering everyone else's needs. At 41, she shocked everyone by quitting her volunteer commitments and enrolling in art classes. Her husband accused her of being selfish. What he didn't understand was that her persona was literally killing her authentic self. The cracks in the persona aren't a sign of weakness. They're a sign that your true self is trying to breathe. When a woman has spent decades molding herself to fit others' expectations, the authentic self eventually demands attention. This often shows up as sudden changes in appearance, interests, or behavior that seem to come from nowhere. But they don't come from nowhere. They come from parts of the self that have been waiting patiently in the shadows. The mistake most people make is thinking that breaking out of old patterns means you're being selfish or irresponsible. But sometimes the most responsible thing you can do is stop abandoning yourself. When you've spent years prioritizing everyone else's needs over your own, reclaiming your authentic desires isn't selfish, it's survival. Try this. Identify one thing you do regularly that feels like should rather than want. For the next week, either delegate it or let it go undone. Notice what comes up. Guilt, fear, relief. That's your persona speaking. Those uncomfortable feelings are the voice of the mask you've been wearing, protesting its removal. Jung taught that whatever we don't integrate, we act out. For women who've spent decades being good, the shadow contains everything that got labeled as bad: sexuality, anger, ambition, wildness, the desire to put themselves first. The shadow holds all the parts of ourselves we learned we had to hide to be loved, accepted, or safe. When the shadow awakens at midlife, it doesn't ask permission. It erupts with the force of decades of suppression behind it. This is why a previously stable woman might suddenly start dressing differently, seeking male attention, or making choices that seem completely out of character. It's not that she's lost her mind. It's that parts of her mind that were locked away are demanding their due. The shadow contains everything we were told we couldn't be while still being loved. For many women, this includes their sexuality, their anger, their ambition, their wildness, their right to prioritize their own needs. Maria was the dutiful daughter, then the dedicated wife and mother. She never allowed herself to feel angry, never prioritized her own desires, never acknowledged her own sexuality beyond its role in pleasing others. She was praised for being so, giving, so patient, so selfless. But all those disowned parts of herself didn't disappear, they went underground. At 43, she left her 20-year marriage for a man 10 years younger. Everyone called her crazy selfish, going through a midlife crisis. But from a Jungian perspective, she was trying to reclaim 20 years of unlived life all at once. The shadow doesn't want to destroy your life, it wants to save it. But when it's been suppressed for decades, its emergence can feel explosive and overwhelming. The key is learning to integrate these disowned parts of yourself consciously, rather than acting them out destructively. Here's a practice you can try right now. Write a letter from the part of yourself you've been hiding. What does she want to say? What has she been trying to tell you? Don't censor it. This is shadow dialogue, and it's the first step toward integration instead of explosion. Understanding that the shadow eruption isn't purely destructive is crucial. Yes, it can cause chaos when it's unconscious, but it's also the psyche's attempt at healing and wholeness. The woman who seems to be destroying her life is actually trying to save herself. She's just going about it in an unconscious way that often hurts everyone involved. Here's where things get dangerous and where many marriages end unnecessarily. When we haven't integrated our shadow, we project it onto others. For women in midlife crisis, this often means projecting their unlived desires onto other men. The affair isn't really about the other man. He's become a screen for her own projected vitality, freedom, and passion. She thinks he holds the key to her aliveness, but what she's really seeking is reunion with her own disowned self. Jung called this falling in love with your own unconscious. It's why these relationships rarely last. They were never about the other person to begin with. The other man represents everything she thinks she's lost or never had passion adventure, the feeling of being desired, the excitement of new possibilities. But these aren't qualities he possesses that she lacks. These are qualities within herself that she's projected outward. David's story illustrates this projection trap perfectly. He came to see me in a state of complete devastation because his wife of 18 years, Jennifer, was having an emotional affair with her personal trainer. She says he makes her feel alive. David told me, the pain and confusion clear in his voice. She says she feels like herself again when she's with him. What am I supposed to do with that? How do I compete with someone who apparently makes her feel things? I can't. I've been a good husband, a good provider. I've never cheated, never lied to her. And now she's throwing it all away for some guy she barely knows. What David couldn't understand, and what Jennifer herself didn't realize, was that she had projected all her vitality, her sense of aliveness, onto this other man instead of reclaiming these qualities within herself. The trainer represented everything she thought she'd lost in 18 years of marriage and motherhood: youth excitement, physical vitality, the thrill of being desired by someone new. When she looked at him, she saw all the passion and energy she felt had drained out of her life, not understanding that these qualities were still within her, just buried under years of routine and responsibility. The trainer wasn't actually special or magical. He was simply the current recipient of Jennifer's projected aliveness. He could have been anyone who paid attention to her, made her feel seen and desired, represented something different from her daily routine. The intensity of her feelings for him wasn't really about him. It was about her desperate need to reconnect with the vibrant, passionate woman she used to be, the woman she'd buried under years of being the responsible wife and mother. This projection trap is one of the most painful aspects of the midlife shadow crisis for families. Husbands feel like they're competing with ghosts, with fantasies, with impossible standards. They wonder what they did wrong, why they're suddenly not enough, how they can compete with someone who seems to effortlessly provide what they apparently can't. The reality is that no husband can compete with a projection, because projections aren't based in reality. They're based on the woman's relationship to her own disowned qualities. The tragedy is that changing partners won't solve the internal split that created the problem in the first place. If Jennifer had left her husband for the trainer, she would have eventually discovered that he was just a regular person with flaws, limitations, and daily routines like anyone else. The magic would have faded as soon as she realized he couldn't actually give her the aliveness she was seeking, because that aliveness was something she needed to reclaim within herself. This is why understanding projection is so crucial for both the women experiencing this crisis and their families. The other man isn't the real problem, and eliminating him from the equation won't solve anything if the underlying psychological split remains unaddressed. The problem is the woman's disconnection from her own vitality, passion, and sense of aliveness, which she's mistakenly believing someone else can provide. Here's a crucial practice for anyone caught in the projection trap. When you feel intensely drawn to someone new, when you find yourself fantasizing about how different your life would be with this person, stop and ask yourself what specific qualities you see in them that you've been denying in yourself. Write them down. Is it their confidence, their freedom, their passion, their ability to prioritize their own needs, their sense of adventure, their sexual aliveness? Those qualities that seem so magnetic in the other person, those are often your own disowned shadow elements, calling you home to yourself. The projection is actually your psyche's way of showing you what you need to integrate what parts of yourself you need to reclaim. The tragedy is when we chase the projection instead of understanding its message, when we try to possess the other person instead of reclaiming the quality they represent. Projection is like a psychological mirror reflecting back to us the parts of ourselves we've lost or never developed. The person we're drawn to becomes a teacher, showing us what we're capable of becoming if we do the inner work of integration. But we have to be willing to take the projection back, to own these qualities as potentials within ourselves, rather than things we can only access through someone else. Families are psychological systems, and when one person is in shadow, crisis, everyone feels it. Children sense their mother's internal split, even when she tries to hide it. They pick up on her restlessness, her dissatisfaction, her desperate search for something she can't name. Husbands feel rejected and confused, watching the woman they married transform into someone they don't recognize. The stability everyone depended on starts crumbling, and nobody understands why. This is perhaps the most painful part of the midlife shadow eruption. It doesn't happen in isolation. A woman's refusal to face her own darkness often means acting it out in ways that wound the people she loves most. But here's what most people don't understand. The crisis wasn't caused by her selfishness. It was caused by decades of self-abandonment that finally reached a breaking point. Rebecca's story illustrates this family implosion with devastating clarity. For 16 years, she had been the perfect mother and wife, the kind of woman other families envied. She managed her 3 children's schedules with military precision, maintained a beautiful home, supported her husband's demanding career, and somehow always seemed calm, organized, and endlessly available for whatever anyone needed. She was the family's emotional thermostat, sensing when anyone was struggling and immediately adjusting her own behavior to restore harmony and comfort. But at 43, something fundamental shifted in Rebecca's psyche. She started staying out late, claiming she needed time with friends, but being vague about where she'd been or what she'd done. She became secretive about her phone calls and text messages, password-protecting devices that had once been open to her family. She began neglecting household responsibilities that she'd once handled automatically, leaving her family confused and increasingly anxious about the changes they were witnessing. The impact on her children was immediate and profound. Her 16-year-old daughter Emma began acting out at school, getting into fights, and skipping classes, unconsciously mirroring her mother's rebellion against authority and responsibility. Her 14-year-old son Marcus became increasingly withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room, afraid to need anything from his mother, who seemed suddenly unavailable and unpredictable. Her 11-year-old daughter Sophie developed anxiety symptoms, asking repeatedly if her parents were going to get divorced, sensing the tension in the household, even though no one had explicitly discussed what was happening. Rebecca's husband Michael withdrew into work, staying at the office later, partly because he was afraid to come home and confront what was happening to his marriage, and partly because he genuinely didn't know how to handle his wife's transformation. The man who had once felt like he had a true partner in life now felt like he was living with a stranger who seemed to resent everything he represented. What Rebecca couldn't see in her desperate need for freedom and self-discovery was how her unconscious acting out of her shadow was creating trauma for the people who depended on her. She felt like she was drowning and needed air, but her gasping for breath was pulling her family underwater with her. Her sudden unavailability, her secretiveness, her abandonment of responsibilities that had once defined her, all of this created a profound sense of insecurity and fear in her children, who were too young to understand the psychology of what their mother was experiencing. Jung said, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." The question that every family in this situation faces is whose pain and how much. The shadow crisis inevitably forces everyone in the family system to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their relationships, and their assumptions about how life should work. For children, it might mean grappling with the realization that their mother is a separate person with her own needs and desires, not just a caregiver who exists solely for their benefit. For husbands, it might mean confronting their own unlived lives, their own suppressed desires, their own relationship with aging mortality, and the dreams they've abandoned. But there's a crucial difference between the natural pain that comes with growth and consciousness and the unnecessary trauma that comes from unconscious acting out. Rebecca's children didn't need to experience their mother's awakening as abandonment. Her husband didn't need to experience her growth as rejection. The crisis could have been an opportunity for the whole family to grow and evolve together, but that would have required Rebecca to take responsibility for integrating her shadow consciously, rather than exploding it unconsciously into her family system. The mistake many people make during this crisis is thinking that personal healing can happen without considering its impact on the family system, or conversely, that you can't pursue your own growth without inevitably harming the people you love. But individual growth and relational responsibility aren't mutually exclusive. The goal isn't to sacrifice yourself for the family's comfort, but it's also not to pursue your personal evolution in ways that unnecessarily traumatize the people who depend on you. Before making any major change in your life, especially changes that will affect your family, try asking yourself, how can I honor my need for growth and authenticity while minimizing harm to the people I love? How can I reclaim parts of myself without abandoning my responsibilities? How can I grow without leaving destruction in my wake? Sometimes the answer requires slowing down, getting professional support, having honest but age-appropriate conversations with your family, or finding ways to integrate your shadow that don't require exploding your life. The families who navigate this crisis most successfully are the ones who understand that the woman's awakening doesn't have to mean the family's destruction. They find ways to support her growth while also protecting the stability that children need and honoring the commitments that marriages require. This is difficult, complex work that often requires professional guidance, but it's possible when everyone involved is willing to see the crisis as an opportunity for the whole system to evolve, rather than as a threat that must be resisted or contained. Most husbands take their wife's midlife transformation personally, and it's hard to blame them. What did I do wrong, they ask. Why isn't she attracted to me anymore? How could she throw away everything we built together? They feel like they're being punished for being reliable, stable, the very qualities their wives once said they valued. The man who worked hard to provide security and stability suddenly finds himself cast as the boring, oppressive force his wife needs to escape from. But here's what's crucial to understand. The shadow eruption isn't about him. It's about her relationship with herself. The tragedy is that many marriages end because neither partner understands what's really happening. The woman feels like she's drowning and needs air. The man feels like he's being abandoned after decades of devotion. Both feelings are valid, and both people are suffering. Tom watched his wife of 22 years become someone he didn't recognize. She started taking dance classes wearing different clothes, talking about dreams she'd never mentioned during their entire marriage. Instead of curiosity, he felt threatened. Instead of seeing her awakening, he saw abandonment. "She's having a midlife crisis," he told their friends, as if that explained everything. They divorced 2 years later, not because they didn't love each other, but because neither understood the psychology of what was happening. Jung taught that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. A wife's shadow crisis often triggers the husband's own encounter with his unlived life, his own suppressed desires, his own relationship with aging and mortality. When Linda started pursuing dance and talking about creative fulfillment, it forced Tom to confront his own abandoned dreams, his own creative desires that he'd sacrificed for career stability and family responsibilities. But instead of seeing his wife's awakening as an invitation to examine his own life, Tom experienced it as a threat to the status quo that had served him well. He wanted his wife to return to being the person she'd been before, not understanding that psychological evolution is a one-way process. You can't unknow what you've discovered about yourself. Can't unfeel what you've felt. Can't go back to unconsciousness once awareness has been awakened. The couples who survive this crisis are the ones where the husband can shift from, "Why are you doing this to me?" to, "What part of yourself are you trying to reclaim?" Instead of taking his wife's transformation personally, he becomes curious about her journey. Instead of feeling threatened by her growth, he sees it as an opportunity for both of them to evolve. Instead of trying to control or stop her awakening, he finds ways to support it, while also expressing his own needs and concerns. This requires enormous emotional maturity and psychological flexibility. It means the husband has to be willing to be married to a different version of his wife than the one he originally chose to find the person he fell in love with within the woman she's becoming, rather than trying to force her back into who she used to be. It means learning to see her individuation as ultimately serving their relationship, rather than threatening it. For husbands dealing with this crisis, the key is understanding that your wife's shadow emergence isn't a judgment of your adequacy as a partner. It's not evidence that you failed or that you're not enough. It's the natural result of her psychological development, her growing awareness of parts of herself that were suppressed during earlier phases of her life. The question isn't whether you can compete with her projections or her fantasies. The question is whether you can love and support the fuller version of who she's becoming, while also honoring your own needs and growth. This often requires couples therapy or individual work for both partners, because the skills needed to navigate this transition successfully aren't intuitive or automatic. But the marriages that emerge from this crisis successfully are often deeper, more authentic, and more satisfying than they were before, because both partners have learned to love the whole person, rather than just the persona, to embrace growth and change as natural parts of a long-term partnership. Every woman in shadow crisis faces a fundamental choice, though she might not recognize it consciously at first. She can continue acting out her unlived life through unconscious, often destructive behaviors that harm herself and everyone around her. Or she can begin the difficult, but ultimately transformative work of shadow integration. This choice point often determines whether the midlife crisis becomes a breakdown or a breakthrough, whether the chaos leads to destruction or ultimately to a deeper, more authentic way of living. Integration means bringing the shadow into consciousness without letting it completely take over your life. It means reclaiming your passion without destroying your commitments, honoring your growth without abandoning your responsibilities, embracing your authentic desires without necessarily acting on them in ways that cause harm. It's about learning to include the disowned parts of yourself in your conscious decision-making, rather than having them erupt unconsciously in ways that surprise and often appall everyone, including yourself. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The path forward through the midlife crisis isn't about denying the shadow or pretending it doesn't exist. That's what created the problem in the first place. It's not about suppressing these newly awakened desires and forcing yourself back into the narrow persona you wore before. It's about learning to consciously include these shadow elements in your life in ways that serve your growth without destroying everything you've built. This is extraordinarily difficult work because it requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. It means learning to be simultaneously responsible and free committed, and growing maternal and sexual stable, and evolving caring for others and prioritizing yourself. Most people want to choose one side or the other, either complete self-sacrifice or total self-focus, because holding both truths simultaneously is psychologically challenging and requires a level of consciousness that doesn't come naturally. The women who successfully integrate their shadow are the ones who stop running from the natural aging process and start seeing it as initiation rather than decline. They begin to understand that the crone archetype isn't about becoming invisible, irrelevant, or powerless. It's about claiming a different kind of power that comes with accumulated wisdom, life experience, and the freedom that can come with having less to prove and less to lose. In traditional cultures, becoming an elder woman was associated with gaining spiritual power, becoming a wise counselor, a keeper of ancient knowledge, a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. The crone had earned the right to speak truth without worrying about pleasing everyone, to prioritize wisdom over beauty depth, over surface charm. She was powerful not because she was trying to compete with younger women on their terms, but because she had claimed her own unique form of influence and authority. Sarah, the woman I mentioned at the beginning, eventually chose integration over explosion consciousness, over unconscious acting out. The process wasn't quick or easy, and it required her to do something that felt almost impossible. At first, she had to end the affair that had made her feel so alive, while also refusing to simply return to who she'd been before the crisis began. She couldn't unknow what she'd discovered about herself, couldn't unfeel the parts of her personality that had been awakened through the relationship with her coworker. Instead, Sarah began therapy and started the slow work of understanding what the affair had represented psychologically rather than just morally. She realized that her coworker had become a screen for projecting all the vitality, creativity, and sexual aliveness she'd abandoned in herself 20 years earlier. The intensity she felt with him wasn't really about him. It was about her desperate need to reconnect with the passionate, creative woman she'd been before marriage and motherhood consumed her identity. Sarah took up painting again, something she'd loved in college, but had abandoned when life became too busy for such impractical pursuits. She started having honest conversations with her husband about parts of herself she'd been hiding for years, not to blame him for her choices, but to invite him into relationship with the fuller version of who she was becoming. She set boundaries around her time and energy that felt foreign and initially guilt-inducing, but that were necessary for her psychological survival. Their marriage looked different afterward, less smooth and predictable from the outside, but more real and intimate from the inside. Sarah's husband had to adjust to being married to a woman who was no longer content to be simply the stable foundation he could count on, who had her own dreams and desires, that weren't always convenient for his schedule or preferences. But he also discovered that he was more attracted to the awakened, passionate version of his wife than he'd been to the dutiful caretaker she'd been before. Integration isn't about perfection, and it doesn't mean you'll never feel the pull of your shadow desires again. It's about developing a conscious relationship with all parts of yourself so that you can make choices from awareness rather than compulsion. It's about learning to feed your shadow in ways that don't require destroying your life, about finding outlets for your disowned desires that honor both your need for growth and your commitments to the people you love. This might mean pursuing creative projects that express your authentic self, developing friendships that allow you to explore different aspects of your personality, traveling in ways that satisfy your need for adventure, or simply allowing yourself to dress, move, and speak in ways that reflect your full personality rather than just the socially acceptable parts. The key is making these choices consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of their impact on yourself and others, rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions that often lead to decisions you later regret. Integration means becoming the author of your own life, rather than either the victim of your circumstances or the slave to your unconscious desires. Practice this. Write down the opposites you're trying to balance in your own life. Maybe it's responsibility and freedom, security and adventure, caring for others and caring for yourself, being a good parent and pursuing your own dreams. Instead of seeing these as mutually exclusive, either-or choices, look for ways to honor both sides. This is the beginning of integration, learning to include rather than exclude parts of yourself, to expand rather than contract your sense of who you're allowed to be. Here's where everything transforms, where the crisis that seemed like an ending reveals itself as the beginning of the most authentic phase of a woman's life. The moment a woman stops fighting her shadow and starts integrating it consciously, the entire dynamic shifts from destruction to creation, from breakdown to breakthrough, from crisis to opportunity. This reversal happens when she realizes a fundamental truth that changes everything. The problem was never with aging marriage, family life, or her external circumstances. The problem was with the psychological split between who she authentically was and who she learned she had to be to deserve love, acceptance, and security. This is what Jung called enantiodromia, the principle that things transform into their opposite when they reach their extreme point. The midlife crisis that appeared to be about ending and loss becomes about beginning and discovery. The chaos that seemed purely destructive reveals itself as the birth pangs of a more integrated, authentic self. The shadow that felt so threatening and dangerous becomes the source of renewed vitality and depth. But this reversal only happens when the woman makes the conscious choice to work with her shadow rather than being unconsciously possessed by it. It requires her to step back from the emotional intensity of the crisis and ask deeper questions. What is my psyche trying to tell me through this chaos? What parts of myself am I trying to reclaim? How can I honor these newly awakened aspects of my personality without destroying everything valuable in my life? Think about this process in terms of natural cycles. Nature doesn't apologize for seasons changing. Spring doesn't try to remain winter. Summer doesn't cling to spring's tentative warmth. A tree in autumn doesn't mourn the loss of its spring blossoms. It transforms those flowers into fruit, then releases its leaves to nourish new growth. The tree in winter isn't less valuable or beautiful than the tree in summer. It's the same tree, expressing its essential nature through different seasonal phases. The midlife woman's psychological task is similar to stop fighting the natural progression of her life seasons and start claiming the unique power and beauty available in each phase. This doesn't mean giving up on vitality, passion, or growth. It means finding these qualities in age-appropriate ways that honor both where she's been and where she's going. The integrated woman over 40 becomes something our culture desperately needs, but doesn't know how to value powerful in her authenticity rather than her conformity, beautiful in her depth rather than her surface appearance magnetic, not because she's trying to attract others, but because she's finally genuinely attracted to herself. She stopped trying to be who she was at 20 and started becoming who she's meant to be at 45, 50, 60, and beyond. Let me give you a comprehensive protocol, 7 steps for moving from shadow explosion to shadow integration, from unconscious acting out to conscious choice-making. First, you must acknowledge the split honestly and completely. Stop pretending you're fine with who you've become. Stop minimizing the parts of yourself you've sacrificed for acceptability and security. Name what you've given up, what you've buried, what you've denied about your authentic nature. Grieve these losses fully. This isn't self-pity, it's necessary. Mourning for the aspects of yourself you abandoned in order to fit in, be loved, or feel safe. Second, begin conscious dialogue with your shadow. Write letters to the parts of yourself you've been hiding, suppressing, or denying for years or decades. Ask them directly, what do you want? What do you need from me? What have you been trying to tell me through my symptoms, my fantasies, my attractions to other people? Give these disowned aspects of yourself permission to speak without censoring their voices or making them socially acceptable. This is shadow dialogue, and it's often the first time these parts of yourself have been allowed to exist consciously in years. Third, identify and reclaim your projections systematically. Where have you been looking for someone else to make you feel alive, passionate, creative, free, desired? What qualities are you seeking in other people that you need to develop within yourself? Take back the energy you've been giving to fantasies about how different your life would be with someone else, and redirect that energy toward becoming the person you're actually capable of being. Fourth, communicate with your family about your growth process, but do it responsibly. Share what you're learning about yourself without making them responsible for your past choices or guilty about your previous self-abandonment. Help them understand that your evolution isn't a rejection of them, but a reclaiming of yourself that can ultimately benefit everyone. Be honest about your needs, while also being realistic about your commitments and responsibilities. Fifth, create conscious integration practices that allow you to honor your shadow without exploding your life. This might mean pursuing artistic endeavors that express your creativity, developing friendships that allow you to explore different aspects of your personality, engaging in physical activities that reconnect you with your body, or simply allowing yourself to dress, speak, and move in ways that reflect your full personality, rather than just the socially acceptable parts. The key is making these choices deliberately rather than compulsively. Sixth, embrace the crone archetype instead of fighting the natural progression of your life. Research examples of powerful older women who inspire you, artists, writers, activists, leaders who claimed their authority and wisdom rather than trying to remain forever young. Understand that you're not losing your attractiveness and power. You're transforming them into forms that our youth-obsessed culture doesn't teach us to recognize or value. Seventh, fundamentally redefine beauty, worth, and success in terms that honor depth over surface, authenticity over conformity, wisdom over innocence. Your value as a human being is not diminishing with age. It's deepening, becoming richer and more complex. Your beauty is not fading. It's evolving from the shallow attractiveness of youth to the profound magnetism of a woman who knows herself completely and makes no apologies for who she is. The transformation from unconscious shadow explosion to conscious shadow integration is like the difference between a destructive wildfire and a carefully tended flame. The wildfire burns everything in its path, leaving devastation and ash. But the consciously tended flame provides warmth, light, and energy that can last for years, illuminating not only your own path, but also serving as a beacon for other women facing the same psychological challenges. Before integration, a woman is split between the dutiful persona she's worn for decades and the rebellious shadow that's been buried underneath, often destroying relationships and stability in desperate attempts to feel alive and authentic. After integration, she becomes a woman who includes all aspects of herself in her conscious choices, who grows in wisdom and depth while honoring her connections and commitments, who serves as a model for others of what's possible when you refuse to abandon yourself for others' comfort. The shadow crisis was never the real problem. The psychological split was the problem. Healing happens when you stop choosing between different parts of yourself and start choosing wholeness when you refuse to sacrifice your authenticity for others' approval, but also refuse to pursue your growth in ways that unnecessarily harm the people you love. This is mature individuation, becoming fully yourself while remaining connected to others, claiming your truth while honoring your responsibilities, growing into your power while maintaining your capacity for love and care. Let's bring this home with clarity and hope. The woman over 40 who seems to be going crazy isn't broken. She's at the threshold of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. The chaos isn't the problem. The refusal to face what the chaos is trying to tell you, that's the problem. Every symptom of the midlife crisis is also a signpost, pointing toward what needs to be integrated. Here's your 7-day integration checklist to begin this work immediately. On day 1, write 3 pages about who you were before you became who others needed you to be. Don't edit, don't judge, just remember and honor that earlier version of yourself. Day 2, identify 1 projection you're carrying. What quality are you seeking in others that you need to develop in yourself? Day 3, have 1 honest conversation with someone you love about what you're discovering about yourself. Share without demanding they change or fix you. Day 4, create space for your shadow in a healthy way. This might be through art movement, creative expression, or simply allowing yourself to feel emotions you've been suppressing. Day 5, practice holding opposites. Write down how you can be both responsible and authentic, both committed and growing, both caring and self-focused. Look for the both and instead of either or. Day 6, research the crone archetype. Find examples of powerful older women who inspire you. See what's possible when you stop fighting your natural development. Day 7, design 1 small change in your life that honors your growth without abandoning your commitments. This is important. This content is for educational purposes and isn't a substitute for professional therapy. If you're in crisis, if you're contemplating decisions that could harm yourself or others, please seek qualified mental health support. The work of integration is profound, but it doesn't have to be done alone. Comment below and share. What's 1 part of yourself you're ready to reclaim? Let's create a community of people choosing integration over explosion, growth over destruction, consciousness over unconscious acting out. Remember this: what looks like madness may be the birth of a truer self. The midlife crisis isn't a breakdown, it's a breakthrough trying to happen. The question is whether you'll midwife that birth consciously or let it destroy what you've built unconsciously. The choice, as always, is yours. But now you have the map to make that choice with wisdom rather than just impulse.